I'm going to do here is I'm going to cover some of the basic safety principles in shooting a Civil War era muzzle-loading percussion firearm. And so before I begin, I just want to start with a disclaimer and just say what I'm going to be talking to you about is really my own opinion from years of shooting. These items have not been peer-reviewed by a panel of experts and or endorsed by some organization. It's really, if you decide to take on a hobby such as this, you take on the risks, of course. Nothing is risk-free when shooting firearms and dealing with powder and caps and those sorts of things. So I just encourage you, verify things and ensure that you are taking on the liability and responsibility when you do this sort of thing. But I am trying to put these things out here probably as an added aid for you. I just want to start with two very basic principles in dealing with any kind of shooting a firearm, particularly an antique firearm. That is, if you purchased your firearm from a company, say it's a reproduction type firearm, there will be a manual. Ensure that you get that manual, that you understand that manual, that you read that manual, that you follow that manual. If you have any questions, contact the company. So that's a very important point. And in addition, especially if you're first time or you're not confident or whatever it might be, you should start your shooting with someone who is much more knowledgeable, has expertise on the types of firearms that you're shooting. Someone who can verify that the gun you're shooting, particularly if it's an antique, is safe to fire. Someone who can monitor your loading and your shooting and be sure you're doing everything safely. Now, that all being said, I want to start with the most basic principle of firearm safety. I'm not going to be covering every safety principle here, but the basic principle that everyone with every firearm is muzzle control. This being the muzzle end or the barrel. The direction of this barrel being pointed, whether the gun is loaded or unloaded, is always in a safe direction. You notice I'm leaning the gun down range as I'm talking, so a safe direction might be up, it might be down at the ground, it might be down range toward the targets. Always in a safe direction. Even if I don't have the gun in my house or I'm showing it to people, whatever, you always treat a gun as if it is loaded and always have it pointed in a safe direction. Muzzle control, we call that. So now, starting with the firearm, any type of firearm you get out, the first thing you're going to do is verify that it is unloaded. Now with a muzzle loader, that's a little bit more difficult. Modern firearms, we do what's called, we open the action, which is this area of the gun on most modern firearms where it loads and unloads. But for a muzzle loader, you load it up from the top. So this area here, we don't call it an action, we call it a lock. In this case, it's a percussion lock because a hammer hits a cap to make it explode. It causes the powder to go off inside here. But to ensure that the gun is safe, the first thing is you want to make actually sure there's no percussion cap, no shiny percussion cap on the end of this. The gun can be placed on half cock. To verify that, all of these firearms should have a working half cock, okay? You should ensure that at some point your gun is safety checked that this half cock works, though it is not a full safety measure. Every proper operating muzzleloader should have an operating half cock. You would test that by making sure the entire weight of the gun could be laid on the trigger, which I'm not going to do right now because I have not verified the gun is fully unloaded. Maybe for a legal state in some states, just not having a percussion cap may be a legal state of unloading, but we want to be sure there's nothing inside to ensure that this is completely unloaded. So we don't put our finger inside the trigger guard unless we're actually firing or unless I need to decock this gun for some reason, okay? So, no percussion cap, that's the first part, okay? The second part is you want to make sure there's nothing inside here, okay? So, how is that done, okay? Well, one of the kind of the old school ways it's done, and this is not necessarily a definite, but you would probably drop this ramrod down in here, okay? And as you can see already, muzzle control becomes something more difficult with a muzzle loader because you have to, at times, have your fingers around the end of the barrel, so you want to minimize that. But as I drop it, you might hear a clink, okay, and that's the sound of steel hitting the base, okay? But again, is that a surefire method? Not necessarily. I found over the years, kids have dumped things down there. Some kid might have put a ball bearing down there, so not necessarily a guarantee. Hearing that sound, what you want to do is actually a ramrod measurement Now someone may have put marks on the ramrod, so when you drop that ramrod down, the mark will show that the gun is loaded. In other cases, the properly fitted ramrod goes with the musket will drop actually surface level when the gun is unloaded, so you know it's unloaded. Now all that being said, these firearms have histories. The ramrod may not have been the ramrod that originally went with this gun, and there could have been changed out. So what you want to do finally is actually verify that that ramrod length from in down there goes right down to where that touch hole would be, where that percussion cap would go. There's room where a breech plug would come into here, but that shows that the ramrod is going right down to the bottom. Of course, for an antique firearm, you would, or any firearm that you would use that wouldn't come straight from the manufacturer, you would want to have with equipment the barrel inspected inside and out. So otherwise also verifying that it is unloaded. So now we verified that we have an unloaded firearm, and next we're going to move to, and that's actually kind of good, I guess, if you're showing it to friends and home and that sort of thing. But when you're at the range, you take added steps before you begin shooting and after you shoot to verify that a percussion firearm is unloaded. And that's the first step is what we call cap off the gun. Now remember, there's a percussion cap that starts the whole process. Now I've not put any powder or bullet in here, but I will fire a cap downrange just to ensure that if there is anything in there, that it would go off and come out. So caps are allowed. So we start with our hearing protection. They can bust, and so we have our eye protection. So always standard with shooting a firearm: ear protection, eye protection. So we're going to shoot one cap here, downrange. Okay. So full cock, cap, downrange, bang. Secondly, we would then do a second cap because that doesn't necessarily 100% guarantee the gun is clear. I've seen caps go and the gun not unload. So the second and final thing is you want to make sure everything is clear. And the way we do that is we cap one to the ground. So I'm putting a cap on here. And we point the gun down toward a leaf or something that we want to see move. You want to see movement. So if you have the camera on the front of the barrel here down toward the ground, you'll see when I hit that cap, you'll see movement in the grass. Okay, that verifies again that everything inside here is clear. And now I have a gun which I can safely begin to load and fire. Now speaking of loading, we're going to put black powder in here. Now there's different types of powders, but one thing you should never ever do is use smokeless powder, a modern type of powder in an antique or any type of muzzleloading type firearm. It could cause a catastrophic failure. You want to use the type of powder that's for your gun. Now, there are black powder substitutes, and they might be usable in some of the reproductions that you might get, and certainly you would read the manual and determine what types of powders you could use in that gun. But what we can say is black powder is a common denominator, and you can use black powder in all your guns. But again, you would want to consult and determine what would be the correct powder loads for that particular firearm. Generally, we shoot a load that is significantly less than what they shot in the Civil War. I am shooting 48 grains of a powder here. Double F type powder is the more proper powder for these. Some people use a triple F faster burning powder, which is really designed for pistols. But we'll just say the double F is a common denominator powder that you could use for these types of muzzleloaders. So now we're going to do the loading process. And so what I'm going to do is pull out one round here, and I have pre-measured powder and bullet in here. And you'll see all sorts of things on YouTube. You'll see people with an open can of caps. You'll see my caps are in this covered pouch. They might be an open can of caps on their shooting table. They might have a can of powder on their shooting table. These are all things you really don't want to do. If you ever saw one of these fire in the dark, you would see sparks going everywhere, coming out of the barrel and wrapping back, and so you really want to have all your shooting items protected. You also don't want to load directly in the barrel from any type of powder horn. For instance, you might look like Daniel Boone, but that is not cool, not safe. Certainly not from the can, one individually measured container. And why? Because it's just possible, and I've actually seen it happen in my lifetime, and I know other shooters have seen it happen, that you could have a burning ember still down at the bottom of this from having capped. Okay, it could be a piece of old patch burning, or a piece of carbon, or it could be something, some lubricant from a previous bullet. So when I would pour the powder down here, you would get what we call a cook-off. The powder would ignite, and you would just see a puff of smoke and flame, and you might even burn your hand, maybe some of your face. These things are possible when you're loading these firearms. So that's why we use just an individual measure of containers. The black powder, uncontained, would burn off very quickly. It's not like that slow burn you see on the old TV shows. You know, it burns just instantly fast. So that's why we load from individual containers. Okay, so I'm going to pull the bullet out. You got a key each time, and here goes the powder. I do it rather rapidly, just again, so I can get it in there. And now I start with the bullet. Now, the one thing we don't do is we don't put our thumb over top of the bullet and shove it in there. My bullet's rather loose, and it's going to sink in. But sometimes your bullet might just stick on the top there, and you really don't want to basically try to what we call thumb the bullet or have anything over top of it other than the ramrod. Now, I want to ensure that bullet goes down there and sinks down there a couple of taps. You really don't want to have an airspace or anything between the bullet and the powder, but you don't really need to slam and smash the bullet either. Okay, so out comes the ramrod. Okay, so we got powder and bullet now in the gun. And all that remains now is for me to actually fire the round. So, from a safety standpoint, again, my finger does not go in here until I'm ready to fire. So, even when I cock and put on cap, and you know, in any kind of shooting range situation, you might be, if it's a competitive event, you might be told load and come to the ready, and you wait with your finger outside the trigger guard. And when you aim, you don't point the gun way up at the sky and drop it down, because you want to keep the gun pointed in the safe direction now that it's loaded. So we're going to try one shot here, just see where it comes out at 50 yards. Now I want to say we're done shooting, okay? And before I leave the line, okay, I want to again verify to the range officer or to whoever I'm shooting with, or certainly to myself, that this gun is 100% unloaded. You say, well, I just saw it go off. Well, I've seen in the midst of shooting, people thought their gun going off, but it didn't go off, or it didn't fully discharge. So before I actually talk about making sure this gun is loaded, I would mention one more thing. It's possible with a firearm that I could have pulled the trigger and nothing could have happened, okay? So, a misfire. Okay, so in that situation, you're going to keep the gun pointed down range. Some people say 30 seconds, some will say 2 minutes. In either case, you have to be prepared for that gun could possibly go off at any time, because there could be a slow burn going on in here, okay? But at some point, if the gun misfired, you're going to recap and try again, recap and try again, okay? Eventually, it's going to go off. Look, if it doesn't, this is why you will have someone who's more experienced with you. You may need to be doing things like possibly getting some more powder in there, cleaning out the cone hole. Hopefully, if your range has a CO2 discharge mechanism, worst case scenario is you might be soaking it and using a bullet puller. All things you don't really get into unless you have someone with some expertise who's working on it. Odds are, if you have a clean gun and you've done everything and done your pre-capping, this gun's going to go off every single time. So we've just done that. Now, before leaving the line with this firearm, we want to doubly be sure the gun is safe, okay? So we're going to go ahead and cap one more downrange. So it's a double cap process again. So caps downrange, again, just the cap. And then lastly, we're going to ensure that the gun barrel is clear. We're going to go to the ground here, and we're going to look at the ground here, and here we go. Watch that ground move. So now this gun is verified safe. I can depart from the line with it, but of course the last thing is we're always going to continue to maintain that muzzle control, keep the gun pointed up in the air in a safe direction and not toward any people. And so those are the basic safety principles. Again, verify and double check with other people on what procedures that you might use with your particular firearm, know your firearm well, and have some safe shooting.